This is part 5, and this will be the last part of the lectures for chapter 6 on metabolism. And we left off here with the citric acid cycle. I wanted to review it, and then we can move on to the next slide. The first step in the citric acid cycle is when acetyl coenzyme A, which has 2 carbons in it, combines with oxaloacetate, which has 4 carbons. And this combination produces a 6-carbon citrate, or sometimes called citric acid, which is where the name of the cycle comes from, citric acid cycle. That citrate is broken down in a series of steps, and every time it's broken down, it loses a carbon. And when it loses a carbon, that carbon forms carbon dioxide. So we can see from one turn of the citric acid cycle that 2 carbon dioxides are formed. And since there are 2 acetyl-CoAs, there are 2 turns of the citric acid cycle for every glucose. So the total is 4 carbon dioxides produced by the citric acid cycle. And then 1, 2, 3 NADHs are produced. Multiply that times 2, and you get 6 NADH molecules. I'm sorry, I'll start that over. 6 NADH molecules for 2 turns of the cycle. And then there's 1 FADH2, so that would be 2 FADH2s total. And then the other thing is GTP, which reacts in our cells just like ATP. It gives our cells energy. So 1 molecule of GTP or ATP is produced, and if that's 2 turns of the cycle, it's going to be 2 ATPs or GTPs. It's really not important. They're both triphosphates, and they store their energy in phosphate bonds. So it's really not important whether it's ATP or GTP. The electron transport chain is the last stage of the citric acid cycle, and it occurs, if this is your mitochondria, and this is the mitochondrial membrane, okay, then this membrane here, this phospholipid bilayer here, is this one here, which is the membrane of the folded part of the mitochondria. Is called the cristae. So when you see intermembrane space, that's referring to this space. And then when you see inner mitochondrial membrane, that's this membrane. And then the mitochondrial matrix is referring to this inside here, this space inside of the inner membrane. So there's an inner membrane, there's an outer membrane. And then what we're watching happen with the electron transport chain is across between the intermembrane space and the mitochondrial matrix. So the electron transport chain is a series of electron transporters, which are blue, embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And what they do is they shuttle electrons and hydrogen ions from the carrier molecules, NADH and FADH2. They provide hydrogen ions and they provide electrons. The electrons are shuttled from here to here to here to here to here, and then they're eventually combined with oxygen and hydrogen ions to form water. So oxygen is the final electron acceptor molecule. If it's an electron from FADH2, it actually goes either this pathway or this pathway. The hydrogen ions are pumped from the matrix into the intermembrane space because of the energy of the electrons. The electrons flowing through the electron transport chain carry energy that allows the hydrogen ions to be pumped out. So the electron transport chain shuttles electrons from NADH and FADH2 until they're finally taken up by oxygen combined with hydrogen to form water. And in the process of shuttling these electrons, the protons or hydrogen ions are pumped from the matrix into the intermembrane space. And then once the hydrogen ions build up in this intermembrane space, once you have a high enough concentration of hydrogen ions in this intermembrane space, they're going to flow by diffusion from their high concentration to their low concentration back into the mitochondrial matrix through this enzyme called ATP synthase. And that energy from the flow of hydrogen ions back into the matrix is going to be enough to add phosphate to ADP, creating ATP. This is exactly the same thing that we saw in photosynthesis. It's called chemiosmosis and oxidative phosphorylation. That is what is occurring with the electron transport chain and the electrons and the hydrogen ions. Okay, and oxidative phosphorylation, this is a picture of the same process. You've got your outer membrane here, your inner membrane here. This is the intermembrane space, and then this is the matrix. Okay, so what's happening is oxidative phosphorylation is occurring. The NADHs and the FADH2s are coming from the citric acid cycle, and they're providing electrons and hydrogen ions to this electron transport chain. The flow of electrons down the electron transport chain is generating the energy to pump hydrogen into the intermembrane space. Then as the hydrogen ions build up, this is the chemiosmosis part, they're going to flow from their high concentration to their low concentration back into the matrix. That energy from the flow of hydrogen ions is used to generate ATP. The molecule that generates the ATP is an enzyme called ATP synthase. And then at the very end, the hydrogen ions are going to combine with oxygen and the electrons from the electron transport chain, and they're going to form water. The oxygen is the final electron acceptor molecule. Now, in addition to aerobic cellular respiration, which involves oxygen, there's also anaerobic cellular respiration. I'm just looking through. Okay. Something that was not really explained to you at all, it looks like, it appears to me, is how much ATP overall is produced. So I'm going to add a slide and just, no, I didn't mean to do that. Before we go to anaerobic respiration, what I want to do is show you the overall okay. Here we go. Okay, so the overall production of ATP by cellular respiration. Where does all that ATP come from? All right, well, first we have glycolysis. Glycolysis forms two ATP molecules directly, and it also forms two NADH molecules. And then the next one is the oxidation of pyruvate. Which produces no ATP, but it does produce two NADH molecules. And then our third step is the citric acid cycle, and that produces 6 NADH molecules. and 2 FADH2 molecules. And it produces 2 ATPs or GTPs directly. So then we come to the electron transport chain. Sorry about that. All right, so 4 ATPs have been produced. Now for every NADH, that NADH, the power from the hydrogen ions and the electrons, can be used to make 3 ATPs. So if we multiply the NADHs by 3, we're going to get 6 more ATPs from glycolysis in the electron transport chain, and then 6 more from the oxidation of pyruvate. 3 times 6 is 18 ATPs from the citric acid cycle, and the FADH2s produce 2 ATPs per FADH2. So 2 times 2 will be 4 ATPs. You can add all these ATPs up now. There's 2 from glycolysis directly, and then 6 from the electron transport chain. There's another 6 from the electron transport chain from the oxidation of pyruvate. There's 2 directly from the citric acid cycle, and then there's 18 from NADH from the citric acid cycle and 4 from FADH2. So add all those together. 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 6 is 10, plus 6 is 16. 16 plus 18 is 34, plus 4 is 38. And 38 is the maximum number of ATPs that can be produced per glucose. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's 36, because there are some variations on this process. Now we can move into anaerobic cellular respiration. So this occurs without oxygen, and anaerobic respiration, one form of it is fermentation. Okay, so one type of fermentation which occurs in our muscle tissue after we've exercised really hard is called lactic acid fermentation. So once we get to the point that we're exercising so hard that we're not taking in as much oxygen as we need, then our muscle cells start to produce ATP by lactic acid fermentation. So what they do is they carry out glycolysis, which produces 2 ATP molecules, and then the pyruvates are broken down into lactic acid, lactate or lactic acid, and that's what causes that burn. This is also performed by the bacteria that ferment milk to yogurt. They're called lactobacillus. And there's some other names too, but I always remember these because the first part of their name is lacto. And then alcoholic fermentation occurs from yeast, of course. Yeast that's used to make bread, yeast that's used to make beer, and other alcoholic beverages. So alcoholic fermentation involves glycolysis. So the glucose is converted into pyruvate, and then that pyruvate is converted into carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol. And so that is the byproduct, is carbon dioxide causes the bubbles, and then the alcohol is produced as ethanol. All right, metabolism and the carbon cycle. This is just showing you how plants consume carbon dioxide and release oxygen, and then the animals consume the oxygen and release carbon dioxide. And it's just a cycle. It says photosynthesis powers 99% of the life on Earth. What powers the other 1%? That's going to be chemoautotrophs, which we learned about some types of bacteria.